My name is Edith Calloway. I am 74 years old, and I have lived in this apartment in Kamloops since the autumn of 1982, which is 15 years now, and I have told no one in this city the thing I am about to tell this recorder. The reason I did not tell anyone before today is that Daniel Swanson was still alive, and I had made him a promise, and I keep my promises. Daniel Swanson died on the 4th of March, 1997, of a coronary arrest, in the house he was born in, beside the Nechako River, north of Vanderhoof. He was 47 years old. I read it in the obituary section of the Prince George Citizen, which I have continued to receive by mail for the 15 years since I left, because the valley stays with you in ways you cannot fully account for. The obituary was 8 lines. It said he was a farmer and trapper of the Vanderhoof area, that he was predeceased by his mother, Margaret Swanson, and that he was survived by no immediate family. I sat with that paper for a long time. Then I got the recorder out of the drawer where it has sat since my niece gave it to me at Christmas. And I sat down at the kitchen table, and I am speaking now. I taught school for 28 years. I want that said plainly before anything else, because what I am going to tell you will sound like the testimony of a woman who lost her grip on something. And I did not lose my grip on anything. I had a firm grip for 28 years on 47 children at a time, in a one-room schoolhouse with a wood stove and a set of encyclopedias from 1949. And none of those children ever went cold or went ignorant while I was responsible for them. And the school board inspectors, who came twice a decade, always left satisfied. I am a practical woman. I do not embellish. When I tell you what I observed over 28 years in that schoolhouse outside Vanderhoof, I am giving you the same account I would have given a school board, if the school board had been capable of receiving it, which it was not. That is not the school board's fault. There are things the school board is not built to hold. I arrived in Vanderhoof in September of 1954. I was 31 years old, and I had been teaching for 3 years in Abbotsford in a large school with several other teachers. And I had applied for the posting in the interior because I wanted to know what it meant to teach in isolation, in a place where the school was the whole of the child's formal world, and you were the whole of its institutional weight. I was young enough to want that kind of weight. The valley gave it to me, and then some. The schoolhouse stood on the Kennydam Road, 7 miles north of town, in a clearing that had been cut from the spruce sometime in the 1930s, and never quite recovered its edges. The trees pressed in on the south and west sides, and the north side looked out over a stretch of cleared pasture that went down to the river, and then stopped where the dark timber began again on the far bank. The building was white clapboard, with a bell that did not ring because the rope had rotted through before I arrived, and someone had tacked a fresh piece of lumber over the doorframe that winter, and the nails were still the bright colour of new iron when I first pushed the door open in early September and stood in the smell of chalk and cold, wood, and the particular dust of encyclopedias. There were 16 children enrolled that first year. Their families were loggers, trappers, one dairy farmer named Fowler who had 40 acres of cleared land, and a daughter named Iris who could do long division faster than anyone I have taught before or since. The children came from 6 or 7 families, most of them settled in the valley since the 1930s or earlier, and they were ordinary children in every way that matters. They were capable and curious, and sometimes sullen and sometimes very funny, and they wore their older siblings' clothes, and they brought lunches that smelled of cold meat and canned pears, and they had the quality that children who grow up with a great deal of outdoor space have, which is a physical ease, an unself-consciousness about the body, because the body has been useful and has not yet been made to feel otherwise. I noticed the Swanson children in my second year, which was 1955 and 1956, when Daniel Swanson was enrolled in the fall as a 5-year-old, and his sister Lena, who was 7, moved up from the primary section. Their mother had brought them on the first day of school in a wagon pulled by a grey horse, and had stood at the fence line for a moment before, turning the wagon back toward the river. I remember thinking that she was a large woman, Margaret Swanson, not heavy but broad across the shoulders in the way that outdoor labor makes women broad, with dark hair gone partly grey and a face that was weathered and composed and gave nothing away that she had not decided to give. She had lost her husband 4 years earlier. That was all I knew when I watched her drive back toward the river. Daniel was the child I noticed first, because he was the youngest, and so the discrepancy was most visible. He was 5 years old, and he was the size of a well-grown 7-year-old. Not fat, not simply tall, but large in every direction, with a breadth to his shoulders and a density to his frame that I had not seen in a child that age. His hands, when he held a pencil, were hands that would have looked appropriate on a man of 30. His face was broad and composed and dark-eyed, and he had the quality that his mother had of giving away only what he decided to give, which is an unusual quality in a 5-year-old. Children that age are mostly transparent. Daniel Swanson was not transparent. Lena was less immediately visible, because at 7 she was simply a large child, and large children are not uncommon. But Lena had a stillness to her that was not childlike stillness, which is the stillness of a child who has been told to sit quietly and is obeying. Lena's stillness was something else. It was the stillness of an animal that is paying close attention to everything in the room and has decided, by its own judgment, that everything is acceptable and is therefore at rest. She sat at the back of the row because she needed the wider chair from the storage room, and she watched me teach with the same expression her mother had worn at the fence line. And when I asked her a question, she answered it correctly and without delay, and her voice was low for a girl her age and carried a resonance that I have thought about for a long time since. I noted these things as a teacher notes things, which is to say professionally and without conclusion. Some children are unusual. Unusual does not mean anything by itself. I had taught a child in Abbotsford who could name every species of bird in the province from memory at age 6, and another who could not read a word at age 10, but could fix any mechanical thing placed in front of him. Children exceed their categories. That is one of the things I love about them. The youngest, Swanson child, Paul, enrolled in the fall of 1960 when he was 5 years old. By that point, I had been teaching Daniel and Lena for 4 and 5 years respectively, and I had observed enough to know that Daniel's size at 5 had not been an anomaly of early development, but a persistent characteristic. At 10, he stood as tall as I did and outweighed me, I estimated, by 40 pounds or more, and he was not done growing. Lena at 12 was a head taller than any other girl in the school, and moved with a quality I can only describe as considered, as if each physical action had been weighed and found sufficient before it was performed. When Paul came through the door on his first day and I saw the same breadth, the same dark eyes, the same composed and attentive face. I understood, as clearly as I have ever understood anything in a classroom, that this was not coincidence. 3 children from the same family, all bearing the same impossible frame and the same particular quality of presence. That is when I made the decision that I have been living inside ever since. I decided to know what I was observing before I did anything about it, and I decided that whatever I came to know, I would not do anything that would harm the Swanson children or their mother. That was the whole of my decision. It was not more complicated than that. A teacher's first obligation is to the children in her care. I understood, even then, that what I was looking at might require a protection I was not yet equipped to provide, and I understood that the most dangerous thing I could do was speak before I had seen. The valley had a way of communicating things it could not say plainly. I had been there long enough by 1960 to understand that Walt Demers, who was the district principal in Vanderhoof and my direct supervisor, had an awareness of the Swanson family that he expressed through a particular careful absence of curiosity. When I filed my annual enrollment reports and listed the Swanson children with their ages and heights and weights, as we were required to do for the provincial health record, Walt would review the form and initial it without comment, and his initialing had a quality of deliberateness to it, a slight extra pressure of the pen that I came to read as a signal. He knew. He had known before I arrived. The valley had arranged itself around this knowledge, the way water arranges itself around a stone, flowing past it on both sides, without ever naming the stone's presence. The other families knew, or knew enough. The Fowlers had a property that abutted the Swanson land on the west side, and old Bernard Fowler had trapped the Nechako watershed since 1938. And I have no doubt that Bernard Fowler had seen what was to be in those 30-plus years of moving through the timber east of the river. His daughter Iris was Daniel's closest companion at school, in the easy, uncomplicated way that children who have grown up in proximity to each other are companions, and she treated Daniel with the same matter-of-fact equality she would have extended to any neighbor's child. I noticed that children reflect what they have been taught at home, and what Iris Fowler had been taught at home was that Daniel Swanson was a neighbor and a friend, and that was the beginning and the end of the relevant information. I first saw the creature in October of 1959, which was 5 years into my posting, and the year before Paul Swanson enrolled, and the year when my understanding shifted from the professional observation of unusual children to something I did not then have a name for, and do not have a name for now. I had stayed late to prepare the following week's arithmetic lesson, which I did on Friday afternoons, when the children had been dismissed and the schoolhouse had settled into its particular after-hours quiet, the smell of chalk and wood smoke, and the wool of 40 children's coats fading into the cooler air of the empty room. It was the first Friday of October, and the light outside the east-facing window was the particular orange light of October, late afternoon in the interior, which is not the gentle gold of summer, but something harder and more deliberate, a light that seems to know it is among the last of the year and wants to leave a mark. I was at the desk with the arithmetic primer when I looked up for no reason I was conscious of, and I saw it at the Treeline. It was standing at the edge of the spruce, on the east side of the clearing, perhaps 40 yards from the window. I could not have said at that moment what I was seeing, because there was no category in my mind that fit what stood there. It was very large, not in the way of the largest man I had known, larger than that, and differently proportioned, with a breadth of shoulder that seemed wrong against the scale of the trees behind it. And it stood fully upright in the manner of a person, not the manner of an animal. And it was watching the schoolhouse. I know it was watching the schoolhouse because I could see, across 40 yards of October light, the direction of its attention. And its attention was on the building I was inside. It stood absolutely still. The spruce behind it moved slightly in the wind that was coming down from the north, and the creature did not move. I did not move either, and I do not think it was fear that held me. I think it was the same instinct that keeps you quiet when you have come upon something that is also keeping quiet and the moment is too precise to interrupt. We stayed that way for what I judge to have been 2 minutes, though I cannot verify that figure. Then it turned, unhurried, and walked back into the spruce, and the trees received it and closed behind it, and the clearing was an ordinary clearing in October light. And I sat at the desk with the arithmetic primer for a considerable time before I was ready to collect my coat and walk to my car. I did not tell anyone what I had seen. I want to be exact about why. It was not because I doubted my own eyes. I am not a woman who doubts her eyes. It was because I had understood, in those 2 minutes of stillness in the October light, that what was standing at the tree line was connected to what sat in my classroom, and that naming what I had seen out loud to anyone other than someone who already knew would set in motion consequences I could not control. The school board was not built to hold what I had seen. The provincial government was certainly not built to hold it. Margaret Swanson's 3 children were sitting in my classroom 5 days a week, and they were learning to read and do sums and behave with kindness toward the other children. And they were my responsibility. And the first thing a teacher learns is that you do not do something irreversible before you have thought it through. My sister Ruth came to visit in the summer of 1961. She was a practical woman, more practical than I was in some respects, and she had never been to the interior before, and I had written her enough about the valley that she was curious. She came on the train to Prince George, and I drove to collect her, and we spent 2 weeks at the small house I had rented near the school. And on the second Thursday of her visit, I took her to the school in the afternoon, because I had some materials to organize, and she wanted to see the building. The Swanson children were not there, it being summer. But we drove past the Swanson property on the way back, and Margaret was in the yard hanging washing, and Daniel, who was 11 that summer, was splitting wood at the side of the house. I slowed the car because Margaret had raised her hand in the brief acknowledgement of a neighbor, and I lowered my window and called a greeting, and Daniel looked up from the woodpile and looked at us, and Ruth looked at Daniel, and I watched her face. She said nothing. Not then. We drove on down the Kenny Dam Road, and then we were on the highway, and then we were nearly at Vanderhoof before Ruth turned and looked at me directly and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "How long have you known?" It was not a question. She said it without the inflection of a question, and I said, "Since 59, well enough to know. Since 55, that something was there to know." Ruth looked forward again at the highway. She said, "Does anyone in town know?" I said, "Walt Demers, the Fowlers, others, I think. Nobody says it." Ruth was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Good," and we did not speak of it again for the rest of her visit. Not directly. But on her last morning, she put her hand over mine at the breakfast table, and she said, You are doing right by them. And that was the only external confirmation I received in 28 years that I was doing right by them, and I have carried it since, and I carry it still. Paul Swanson was enrolled in September of 1960, and he was in my classroom until June of 1971, which made him my student for 11 years. He was the quietest of the three, and the most like his mother in face, with Margaret's broad jaw and her habit of observing before acting, and he had the same quality Lena had of being in a room in a way that was utterly present without drawing attention to itself. He learned to read easily and liked history best of any subject, particularly the history of the land, the geographic and geological history, the way the rivers had moved over centuries, and the way the mountains had been made. I gave him a geology text from my own shelf when he was 12, and he returned it 2 years later with careful pencil notes in the margins. All of them questions, none of them answered in the text, and I took those questions and did my best to answer them in the next week's lesson, so that he would know I had read what he had written. Daniel finished his schooling in 1965. He was 15 that spring, which was the age at which the provincial curriculum ended for a one-room school, without an upper years program, and after that, he would have had to board in Vanderhoof to continue. And Margaret had made clear, without being asked, that Daniel would not be boarding in Vanderhoof. He went home to the property and took up the work of it, the trapping and the small farm, and I saw him occasionally in town when he came in for supplies, and he was always courteous and always briefly spoken and always very large. He had reached by that point a height that I estimated at 6 feet and 3 inches, and he weighed, by my professional estimate and the evidence of the door frames he navigated with care, something in the range of 260 or 270 pounds. He had his father's breadth. That was what I thought then, and still think now, though I had not known Gerald Swanson, who had been lost in the bush east of the Nechako in the winter of 1951, 2 years before my arrival. Lost in the bush. That was the phrase the valley used. Nobody said otherwise. The January of 1965, the month before Daniel left school, was the occasion of the second, and last time I saw the creature clearly. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of January, and the light was already failing at 3:30 in the way it fails in the interior in January, dropping fast and going blue before it goes dark. I was reading aloud to the class from a natural history text, a chapter on the watershed systems of the interior plateau, because Daniel had asked me about the subject 2 weeks earlier, and I had found a suitable text. The children were at their desks, 15 of them that year, and the 3 Swanson children were at the back of the room, Daniel in the large chair, and Lena and Paul on the bench beside it. The 3 of them, with the quality of calm attentiveness they always had, present and contained. I was facing the class, and the window was behind them on the west side of the room, and the light was going. I did not see it at first. I saw the children see it. Not all the children, the other 12 children, did not react. But the 3 Swanson children, in sequence, turned their heads to the window, unhurried and without alarm, and their faces held the same expression, which was the expression of recognition, and something I can only call greeting, though no words passed anyone's lips. I kept reading for a moment because a teacher learns not to be the first to change the register of a room, and then I turned. It was at the window, not at the tree line, at the window itself, which meant it had crossed the clearing and come to the building, and it was close enough that I could see, in the blue remaining light, the dark fur and the broad face and the eyes, which were dark and very large and fixed on the room, with a quality of attention I recognized. The same attention that had watched the schoolhouse from the Treeline 6 years before. Except now it was close, and now the room it was watching contained its children, and it was not, I understood then, watching the building. It was watching me. I did not move. I held the Natural History text open in my hands, and I stood at the front of the classroom, and I looked back at the creature at the window, and it looked at me, and the Swanson children did not move and did not speak, and the other 12 children did not look up from their desks, and I have never been able to fully account for that. Whether it was chance, whether they were absorbed, whether the creature's presence was legible only to those who were already connected to it in some way. The creature looked at me for perhaps 30 seconds, and then it inclined its head, once slowly, in a way that I had never seen an animal move, but that I understood immediately and completely. It was not a bow, it was not submission, it was an acknowledgement. It was saying, I see you. I know what you have done for them. I know who you are. Then it stepped back from the window and was gone, and the light outside was blue and then dark, and I stood at the front of the classroom with the Natural History text open in my hands, and finished the chapter, and the 3 Swansonshire children turned back to their desks and listened, and none of us spoke of it, and class was dismissed at 4 o'clock, and the other children collected their coats and their lunch pails and went out into the January cold. I have thought about that gesture for 32 years. I have thought about whether I interpreted it correctly, whether a gesture made by something so far outside my experience could be interpreted at all. I have concluded that I did interpret it correctly, because the interpretation has never stopped making sense. It was aware of me. It had been aware of me since October of 1959, which means it had been watching the schoolhouse for 6 years. Watching the children who came to the schoolhouse. Watching the woman who stood at the front and taught them. It came to the window in January of 1965, the last winter its oldest child was enrolled, to let me know that it had been watching, and that the watching had not been neutral, that it had seen what I had done, which was nothing, which was the right thing. I had kept its children safe by keeping them ordinary, by asking no questions that would mark them as different, by defending their right to be students in the way all students are students. And it had watched me do this for 6 years, and in January of 1965 it came to the window, and it told me it had noticed. That is what I believe. I do not claim to know it. I believe it. Lena finished school in 1963 and spent 4 years on the property with her mother and brothers before she left the valley in the summer of 1967, when she was 15 and old enough to make the decision herself, though it was not an age at which most parents would have called the decision entirely the child's. Margaret told me, in the late summer of 1967, that Lena had gone north. That was all she said. She said it across the fence line of the schoolyard, where she had stopped the wagon on a morning when I was outside. And she said it simply, as she said everything. And she said it without looking at me, and then looked at me afterward. And I nodded, and she nodded, and the wagon moved on. I have thought about Lena going north many times. She was 15, and she was the one of the 3 who had always seemed to exist most comfortably in the space between worlds, by which I mean she was at ease in the schoolroom, and she was also visibly at ease in the presence of the timber in a way that the other children were not. Not Daniel's dense gravity, not Paul's quiet scholarly interest, but something more fluid, more prepared. She had been preparing to go north, I think, for a long time. Where north was, I do not know. I do not know, and I have not speculated. She went where she needed to go. That is all. Paul was my student until June of 1971, when he was 16, and had absorbed everything the one-room curriculum had to offer, and was ready for more than I could give him. He boarded in Vanderhoof for 2 years, which he had agreed to, and he wrote to me twice during that period, both letters brief and precise and full of geological questions that the Vanderhoof School was not answering to his satisfaction. I answered both letters at length. He did not finish the upper years program. He left Vanderhoof in the spring of 1973 and returned to the property for 2 years before he moved to Fort St. James in 1975. He would have been 20 years old. I received one letter from him in 1976 from Fort St. James, which thanked me for the geology text and said that he had found work with a surveying company and that the country up there was something worth mapping. I wrote back but received no reply, and that was the last I heard from Paul Swanson directly. Margaret Swanson died in the winter of 1972. She was 61 years old, which is not old, and she had been alone on the property since Paul went to Vanderhoof with Daniel nearby and coming by the river road most days, and she had been well enough by all accounts until the November, when she was not. Daniel was with her. He came to tell me on a morning in December, before school, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and told me, and his face held the composed and giving nothing away quality it had held since he was 5 years old. And then it shifted for a moment, in the way a face shifts when grief decides it will be visible after all, and then it composed itself again. I said that she had been a good mother to him, and he said yes, and then he said she was a good woman, and there was something in the way he said it, with a particular weight on the word woman, that I understood to mean something larger than I was able to ask about, and I did not ask. I continued teaching until June of 1982, which was 28 years in total, and in those last 10 years after Margaret died, and the Swanson children were grown and gone, except for Daniel. On the property, the valley settled into a different kind of knowledge. Not the active, watchful knowledge of the years when the children were in school, a quieter kind. The logging had changed the timber on the east bank of the Nechako. More of it was gone than had been gone before, and what had been deep and unbroken from the river to the mountains was now interrupted by cut lines and secondary roads. And the change in the timber changed something in the quality of the valley's attention, though I could not have said exactly what. I drove the Kenny Dam Road for 28 years, and in the last 5 of them the drive felt different from the drive of the first 23. Something had pulled back. Something that had been present at the edge of things had retreated further in. In my last October in the valley, which was October of 1981, I was driving home from school on a Friday afternoon, the same arithmetic preparation. Friday it had been in 1959, and I slowed the car at the place where the road curves closest to the river before it, turns back toward town, because there is a break in the willows there, where you can see the Swanson property across the water, the house and the outbuildings, and the cleared land going down to the bank. Daniel's truck was in the yard. There was smoke from the chimney, and at the far edge of the cleared land, where the timber began. Again on the property's east side, I saw a stillness that was not the stillness of the trees. I did not stop the car. I slowed it, and I looked, and I kept driving. And I think what I saw was what I had always thought might still be there, not gone, only further in, only come back to the edge of the clearing in the October light. Because October is when the light is right for it. I retired in June of 1982 and moved to Kamloops in September. I packed 28 years of books and lesson plans, and the geology text that Paul had returned with notes in the margins, and I drove the Kenny Dam Road one last time on a morning in late August, before I had loaded the car just to drive it. I did not stop at the Swanson property. I drove past it, and I looked across the water at the cleared land and the dark timber beyond it, and I kept driving, and I did not look back. Daniel Swanson sent me a card the following Christmas, and then a card each Christmas after that, until 1996, which was the last one. The cards were never sentimental. They were brief, the way all his communications were brief. A sentence or two about the weather and the state of the trapping that year, and whether the snow had come, early or late. Nothing about his brother or his sister. I never asked, and he never offered. Each card was signed with his name and nothing else. In 1993, he wrote, in addition to the weather, that the east timber was coming back in some sections where the cut lines had been left alone for a decade, and I read that line several times. It seemed to me the most important thing in the card. It seemed to me like news. When the December of 1996 passed without a card, I marked it. I told myself there were ordinary reasons for a card not arriving. The post is uncertain. A person forgets. A person has a difficult year. I told myself this until March of 1997, when the Prince George Citizen arrived with Daniel Swanson's obituary in 8 lines, and I understood that the December silence had not been the post. I am recording this because I was his teacher. I was the teacher of all 3 of them, and I kept their secret for as long as they were alive and needed me to keep it. Daniel is gone now, and Paul I have not heard from in 20 years, and Lena went north 30 years ago, and there is no one left whose safety depends on my silence. That is why I am speaking. I want to say one thing about what I observed in 28 years of teaching in that valley, and I want to say it as plainly as I have said everything else. The 3 Swanson children were good students, not in the narrow sense of high marks, though Lena's reading was the best I taught, and Paul's logical mind was remarkable. Good students in the sense that they were present and curious and honest in their engagement with the world, as I presented it to them, the world of arithmetic and natural history and the English language and the way maps represent terrain. They brought their full attention to that world every day, for the years they were in my care, and they gave the other children around them no reason for anything other than the ordinary regard one classmate has for another. They were not separate from the human world. They belonged to it as much as they belonged to whatever other world their father came from and their sister returned to. I do not know what they were. I have had 40 years to think about it, and I still do not know, and I think not knowing is the correct position to hold. Margaret Swanson knew, and she kept it without a word for the 20 years between her husband's disappearance and her death, and if she could bear not explaining, I can bear not knowing. The valley bore it without explanation for longer than any of us were there to observe. The valley understood something that I have spent 40 years learning to understand which is that the world does not owe you a name for everything that lives in it. Daniel Swanson died on the 4th of March, 1997. He was 47 years old. He is buried, the obituary said, at the Vanderhoof Cemetery, in the section that faces the river. I hope the timber is visible from where he is. I hope when the light comes at a certain angle in October, something is watching. I am finished. I am going to turn this recorder off and put it back in the drawer, and I am going to write to the Vanderhoof Historical Society and ask them to archive it after my death. I do not know if they will. I do not know if anyone will listen, or if anyone who listens will believe, or if belief is even the right word for what I am asking of the person who hears this. I am asking for something simpler than belief. I am asking for the same thing I asked of Daniel and Lena and Paul for 28 years in that schoolhouse, which is only this: your full attention and the willingness to sit with what you do not understand. That is all any of us can offer. It was enough then. I hope it is enough now.